Well, today on UVA Legends podcast, I have 1980s UVA soccer with three Northern Virginia and UVA soccer legends. Brian Vernon, who played attacker for Annandale High School and also UVA, of course. Scott Platenberg, who was I understand, a left wingback who played at West Springfield and also UVA, of course. And then my old pal Keith Lenert, we call him Primo, who was a goalie in Annandale, also, of course, a star basketball player, and he played goalie at UVA and beyond. Guys, thanks for doing this. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
For having us, Julian.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Good to see you.
Yeah, of course. Well, when you think about soccer, when you guys played, it was a different environment. Now, soccer is the number one participation sport for kids in the USA. It's quickly becoming the number one spectator sport with the Premier League on Saturday mornings and the Champions League. So soccer really changed. When you guys played, it was almost a niche sport. It was played in the Washington, D.C. area. It was played in New Jersey. It was played in Long Island. But it really wasn't. It was played by immigrant groups all over the country, like West African groups, Caribbean groups, European immigrant, like Italian communities in New Jersey and so forth. But it wasn't played all over the place. And you guys came along at a time when people were starting to play soccer en masse. And one thing I'll say about soccer, it was a little different. I talked to Scott and Keith's classmate, fellow Adam alum, Mark Cox, and he made the comment, if you lost to someone in football, you get them back in basketball. If you lost them in basketball, you get them back in baseball. He didn't mention soccer. When I was talking to Greg Wells the other day, he told me the soccer coach at Robinson didn't want him to play other sports. So I think soccer was more insular than other sports at the time. Even I think Keith played basketball, of course, and others did. I know Phil Denfield played football and soccer as well. But generally, soccer was kind of on an island of its own. So it was a very different environment. So when we nowadays are many more of our better athletes are playing soccer. You guys kind of started that. You guys were on the forefront of that. So anyway, let's go back and let's talk about each of your backgrounds, and you guys can kind of talk about where you played club, why you played soccer, what drew you to soccer, maybe your club, a little bit about your club experience, and we'll get back to high school later. So why don't we go with Brian first, since he's kind of the new one on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. So my story probably is not that different from Keith's story because we grew up just a couple streets away from each other and we're only a year separated. But I played the club level when it really just first began. I was looking online a little while ago, and Braddock Road, I think it was Braddock Road Boys Club, Keith, wasn't it? When it first started out, changed to Braddock Road Youth Club, was founded in 1966. And I remember that, the first year that I was available to try out for a select team, that's what they called it, select soccer. I went and did it. And, I was a 63, my birth year. So that was really kind of my introduction into a higher level of playing. But, I did all the sports as a kid, played baseball, played basketball. But soccer was just, for me, was something that was a bit, probably because I was so hyper, it better fit me. And so my youth started off with Braddock Road Select. And a couple years later, an individual named Mr. Guevara, who was Charlie Guevara's dad, and I'll probably talk about Charlie a little bit. He's a very good friend of mine. And to me, probably the best player to come out of Northern Virginia in our age group. His father started Little River Soccer Club. They were Argentinian. And so I might get that, Keith, Little River Youth Club, whatever they called it. And his dad was coach. So I moved from Braddock Road over to Little River, and that's kind of where I played my youth. And I think I probably got a lot of my training and my teaching from Mr. Guevara, who was a really good player in his own right. So, and then from there, kind of went to high school.
You mentioned Little River. Is that Little River Turnpike or River after River Plate in Argentina? Which one? Where was Guevara going with that?
Well, I'm pretty sure because Mr. Guevara was Argentinian, he named it after Little River, in the Argentinian club.
Yeah.
But it was a new youth program that started, and we had a lot of great players in it. So we then played the Braddock Roads and the Annandale Boys Clubs, your typical competition.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Brian. How about Scott out there in sunny San Diego?
Yeah.
How did you get started playing soccer? And I know you're also a wrestler as well, I believe.
Well, I wrestled for social reasons because they had good parties back in the day. But I grew up and just had a passion for playing soccer. But I didn't play organized soccer until I was 10 years old. And we used to play all kinds of sports in the neighborhood, and I'm the fifth of five boys. So I had older brothers to look up to and to compete with or try to. But we had a great neighborhood, and we played all kinds of different sports. And one of the dads in the neighborhood told my mom, who was raising these five boys on her own after a divorce, that he would take me to the rec soccer practices if I joined and played with his son, my good friend. And so that's how I got into organized sports, and it was soccer. We played a lot of soccer in the neighborhood. I think you were talking about the beginnings of clubs. I got a little involved with clubs out here, and most of them date to around the early 70s. So I think there was a movement and it could have been immigrants or others, and also for whatever reason, maybe the NASL had a lot to do with it. But there were clubs forming, and so I joined Springfield. I think it was youth club when I joined, so it had already existed for a couple of years. Like I said, I was 10, so that was 1976 when I first started playing organized rec soccer. And then I just fell in love with it, and I've had a passion for it ever since. I didn't play any other organized sports. My dad was quite an athlete, but he wasn't around to bring me into his sports, which were baseball and football. So I just had a passion for soccer that started at a young age. I don't know what created it, but I just remember falling in love with it early.
Well, you were so passionate. Keith tells me you joined a club up in Columbia for a while. So you were traveling across the bridge
So my evolution was, and I don't know how common it was to be switching clubs back in the day, but I started at Springfield, and then a friend of mine who was a great player, his name was Russ Spangler. He had joined Braddock Road, and our team was the Blue Jays, the 1966 Blue Jays. And I went over there with him and another player from West Springfield High School, who both of them later stopped playing soccer. Russ got a bad injury. The other player stopped playing. So I was the only Spartan on the Braddock Road Blue Jay team. And we were a top team, but we never won the national championship at the under 19 age level, even though we were state champions for a couple of years. So we upset the older team, the 65 age group team. And then when it was our turn, we got upset. And we never made it to the finals. So I was still age eligible. And as were a couple of other Blue Jays, names you would know, like Tommy Nicholson, Tony Riente, whose dad was our main coach, Keith Stetzer, a couple of players that you'd recognize. We went up and we joined the Columbia, Maryland team for our last year of eligibility. And with that team, they were the Columbia Kick. We were the Braddock Road Blue Jays. We created the Columbia Jays and went on to win the McGuire Cup that the Annandale team years before us had won. So that's what that's how I got, was playing for a Columbia, Maryland team back in the day.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Keith, what about you? I know you come from definitely a basketball and sports family. And as a goalkeeper, always a goalkeeper's evolution is always different than every other position because you don't really become important until 13 or 14, even though maybe it was different back then. But what about you, Keith? How did you get into soccer?
So I'm birth year 1964. And as Brian alluded to, we grew up in the same neighborhood, just a couple of blocks away from one another. And my father was a pretty good athlete, college basketball player. So we were always involved in sports. I'm one of four. I'm the second of four. My older brother, Jeff, was a very good scorer in the high school basketball leagues. Then I was next. My sister, Laura, played varsity soccer, varsity basketball, varsity tennis. My younger brother, Mark, played varsity football, varsity basketball, varsity soccer as center midfielder, point guard, and quarterback, respectively. So we were always playing sports in our neighborhood, in our house, in our backyard. And as Brian can certainly attest to, our tight community, probably within a half to 3/4 of a mile radius, had a lot of elite athletes, both on the girls and boys side. So any corner you turned, there was some sort of sporting activity going on. And it usually spanned probably 8 or 10 years, from those older than us to those younger than us. My parents lived in Germany briefly. My dad was on a business assignment over there. So they lived in Hof, Germany, which I believe is in Bavaria. This is before I was born. My older brother was there. But I think they were exposed to soccer in the Bundesliga and the passion that the Germans had for soccer. And even though my dad didn't play, I think he and my mom appreciated how passionate they were about soccer over there, football. And then when they moved back, I was born shortly thereafter. And a few years later, probably late 60s, early 70s, we were exposed to the Braddock Road Boys Club. As Brian said, at that time, it was Braddock Road Boys Club. It was Fairfax Police Youth Club. It was Annandale Boys Club. And over time, the evolution included girls, rightfully, as well. But I think my parents signed me up for recreational soccer because I had never played football, and they just saw it as an alternative that was probably safer and made me more active. Not that I needed that, but so I was exposed very early, and I grew up in the Braddock Road Boys Club, Braddock Road Youth Club environment. And Scott and Brian will tell you that probably the richest tradition in the Northern Virginia soccer area is the Annandale Boys Club, Annandale Boys and Girls Club now. But Brian and I were kind of on, even though we were in the Annandale High School district, we were on the western edge of the Annandale boundary. So when they kind of started to develop Braddock Road Boys Club, Braddock Road Youth Club, it was attractive to those of us that really didn't have a soccer club yet. So those Braddock Road teams in the early years had a smattering of really talented players and a whole host of very athletic kids just hungry to compete. So we may not have been the most refined at that time, but we were able to compete with most clubs and most teams. And I just never stopped from that point on. You alluded to my goalkeeping years, and early on, I was an attacking player. I was bigger and faster than most. And as the years progressed, I was still bigger, but other kids became faster. So I moved from attack to midfield to defender, and eventually ended up in the goal, which I think made good use of the complementary skills of basketball and soccer with the footwork and the handwork, passing angles, shooting angles, stuff of that nature. And I can't remember whether it was the 74 or 78 World Cup, but my parents, for my birthday, gave me tickets to the simulcast of a couple of games at DAR Constitution Hall. And at that time, you couldn't really get coverage of World Cup matches around here, or really anything other than Soccer Made in Germany, which I believe was on Sundays for maybe an hour or so. So I went to Constitution Hall with my father and was exposed to the World Cup on a huge screen with basically a packed house of mainly multi-ethnic people just going bonkers over World Cup matches. And I was smitten at that point in time and just have never looked back.
Well, that's a good point, Keith. Where do the role models come from? A lot of times you guys were coached by people who didn't play soccer, like Bruce Arena. I believe he was a lacrosse coach. There wasn't a generation of folks who had played a lot of soccer before us to be coaches. So some of the coaches hadn't played much, and I guess they learned the game. But in terms of coaching, but also role models, Keith mentioned the Bundesliga on Saturdays, which I've heard. I think Barbara Wickstrand mentioned that as well. Who did you guys try to play like? Who did you? I remember watching, and everyone was there. I remember going to watch Pele play at RFK in the late '70s. But we couldn't really emulate people because it really wasn't on TV. And maybe it was just the players that we saw play locally.
Yeah, good point. Primo, I don't know if I guess, Julian, given our age, right, and the arrival of the NASL, that really, I mean, if you're looking for probably influence, that was the biggest thing. You're a few years younger. There was a time, for whatever reason, and Keith can tell me, RFK was damaged, and they moved the NASL games out to Woodson High School, right? And so, I mean, for us as kids, I still remember those moments, going to that game or those games and seeing these bigger than life guys. So I guess that was for me, probably. It certainly wasn't college players, and I didn't really know much about the international scene. So maybe as a high schooler, maybe a little bit less, a little lower in age, maybe the NASL guys were the bigger influence. Keith, what about you?
Some great players there.
Yeah.
For me, I would watch Soccer Made in Germany when I could. But in our community, like I said, there were plenty of fantastic athletes, including soccer players. But I was a multi-sport athlete, so I really kind of revered those guys that excelled at multiple sports. And specialization was really not a big deal at that point in time. So my parents always encouraged me, and I always felt that, hey, if you enjoyed multiple sports, you should play multiple sports. And if you can excel at multiple sports, why not do it? Get the most out of it. So in our community, in our neighborhood, 2 doors away from me was a guy named Danny Malm.
Yeah.
Extraordinary athlete. He's a football player, soccer player, and basketball player. I think 11 varsity letters between the 3 sports.
Yeah.
And I'd watch him, and it was remarkable to see him play and train. And I just revered that. His commitment. I'd sit in our family room like Saturday mornings, early cartoons or something, and he'd bound out his front door in his red issued Annandale football shorts and running shoes, nothing else. And he'd stretch a couple of times, touch his toes, and he'd take off running. I'd still be sitting in the family room eating breakfast, watching cartoons, and 20, 30 minutes later, he'd come striding back into the cul-de-sac and glistening with sweat like he'd done nothing, still standing as tall and stoic as when he left. And that was inspirational to me.
And before Scott, I just want to add to that, Julian, that was Phil Denfeld's, teammate, Danny Malm. Those guys were all from a certain era. So I think one of the biggest differences, just to add to this, is, when we were coming up, there was no focusing on one sport. It just didn't happen. I mean, as kids, you played everything, and there's an argument: are you more well-rounded, right? When you do start to get the high school level, and then you want to focus on a sport, whatever you're really good at. For me, it was soccer, but we all played different sports. It was just the way it is. It's just so different now. Scott has young kids. Keith has kids that just came up through, the high school ranks. It's a different world that I just haven't had to deal with.
I think, Brian, you were a pretty accomplished tennis player as well, if memory serves.
Yeah, you know, I was a good all-around athlete, but you know, it's just I never thought about like throwing it all away and just playing soccer. Maybe I would have been better.
Imagine that. Imagine how many goals you would have scored.
Yeah.
How about you, Scott?
So
Role
inspiration,
models?
I definitely have one, and that was the Washington Diplomats. So I'm a little younger than Brian and Keith, and so I don't know if they were as big a deal at a certain age for them as they were for me. But I had a neighbor whose parents were season ticket holders, and they were in the fan club. And every now and again, I'd get invited to go with them to RFK Stadium and go see Dips games. And one game, I actually got to be a ball boy for the Washington Diplomats, and it was very memorable. I had my first rum and coke at the RFK Stadium in the club,
but not your last.
No. I've changed. I don't know that I drink rum and cokes anymore, but yeah. Johan Cruyff, when he came to the Washington Diplomats, it was huge.
Yep.
And he became my hero like overnight. It was such a big deal. And looking back on it, I think he only played for like a year and a half, and some of it was injury. He was injured, but the impact it had on me was like a lifetime. So it's amazing that it was just a short period of time, but it was huge for me. So he was my inspiration. I loved the Dips, and again, they didn't last too long, but I was just at that age where it had a huge impact.
It's funny, the NASL, some of the players, I didn't realize how big they were until recently when my son got into soccer. Like, I didn't know who George Best was when I was a kid. And
Carlos Alberto, Pelé. I mean, obviously, right?
yeah,
But Scott said it, man. When Cruyff came to the Diplomats, that was just huge. And I was just looking up when you guys were talking, the Diplomats were conceived in 1974. So, I'm 11 years old, Scott's probably 7 or so. But yeah, that's that was a pretty big influence, Julian, for us. I remember playing on the field before the Diplomats game, when they used to have the young guys come out and we'd play like a 20-minute, 15-minute game. Certain memories like that stand out.
What's interesting
I
about
would say that, with respect to the Diplomats, there were players, the players that I remember from our communities and the Northern Virginia area, I can go back probably 7 years ahead of me. So maybe 1957. Before that, it's all fuzzy, or I don't really know names. But there are a few guys from the area that played for the Washington Diplomats in the NASL. And or Team America in the kind of idle years between the NASL and the next leagues. Kep Germain from Annandale Boys Club was a member of the Diplomats. Rob Olson, a Robinson alum, was a member of Team America. So there were guys that we could identify with, that we aspired to achieve that same sort of success. I'd be remiss if I didn't say, for Brian and myself, both at Annandale, the Annandale Red Wings were great, and Phil Denfeld and Casey Cannon in our neighborhood, and Warren Gettler and Duff Milholland. But some of the Annandale high school guys that really, I guess, paved the way or shone the light for me, Carl Strong.
There you go.
Who was an NASL player, and Carl Strong, and who else in the Danny Malm? Dave Powell. Dave Powell, who also went to UVA, and he was just an exceptional soccer player.
Good athlete.
Yeah.
Gary Etherington, was he
Mount Vernon?
Yeah.
Mount Vernon. Yeah.
Seems like we had more of our fair share from Northern Virginia. I also like the NASL because we didn't try to act like European teams and give them European-like names like the Philadelphia Union or the Atlanta. Tampa Bay Rowdies. We named our teams like we would in America. We didn't try to be European. We tried to have a soccer played in a league as Americans would do it. So it's a little bit different feel than the soccer is today. Hey, so guys, when you go to high school, you guys are both from amazing football schools. Annandale was the football school. I think of the first 4 state champions that they crowned when they first started playing a state championship. Annandale may have won 3 of them or something ridiculous like that. And I think they won the national championship. And I should know this. I interviewed them 78. Yeah. And then Scott went to West Springfield. Jack Brooks is one of the best running backs I'd ever seen. But West Springfield had an incredible football history, but unbelievable basketball history in the early 70s. Where did soccer stand at those schools? Was it, I know at Robinson, they were very good and the girls liked all the soccer players, but nobody went to the games. I mean, it wasn't on the radar of the school generally. What about at West Springfield and Annandale?
So where we ranked at West Springfield, since you mentioned it first, I'll go. We were lower than name any sport. Our first game, I remember playing the first game of the season. They had reseeded the football field for the following season. It wasn't the concurrent. It wasn't at the same time. It was a different season. They had reseeded it and they had covered the playing surface with hay. So imagine trying to play a soccer game on hay. And it was dangerous. Parents went home. They got rakes and they ended up raking the field at halftime just so it made it so that we could play. So, we were definitely ignored by the school pretty much. We had a following, friends and parents and stuff, but I don't know how much different it is today. My daughter's playing high school soccer and still it's mostly friends and parents. It's not a huge community thing. The students don't really embrace it a ton. I don't know how different it is there. But it's definitely bigger and more respected and they've got a great program here locally. But for us back in the day and especially at West Springfield, it was not held in high regard.
Yeah.
Guys,
I think Keith, you and I can take this one together. I think Annandale, I mean, I look back, Julian, on Annandale, and you just have to put the time frame right in perspective. Our coach at Annandale High School was, very nice man, Ted Leggett. He was a industrial arts electronics guy. And I mean, he knew as much about soccer as all of us, it was nothing, right? I mean, and at the time you just kind of went along with it because that's what your option was. So, but as far as how that kind of, rolled over into the field, I mean, we played on the football field, right, Keith? I mean, that was what you did back then. I think our crowds were not big by any means, but they weren't just empty. I mean, we did have some support because I think of the community, and we were a pretty good team. So, but it was just more about, to me, when I think back about that time, and we'll get into this a little bit more, it was just the I don't want to say lack of coaching in general, but just it was more like somebody just organizing a group of people. And sometimes I felt like, maybe I was coaching on the field, or the other, just the way it was. Keith, what do you think? Anything more on that?
I would agree with you. I think at Annandale, the student body supported us decently at games.
Yeah.
The other athletes maybe kind of looked a little askance at soccer play because it was fairly nascent. And, a lot of the elite football players that Annandale was known for their football and basketball and baseball. Those were the three sports for most elite male athletes growing up in our era and certainly before our era. You alluded to Mark Cox. He played three. He was basketball or football, basketball, baseball. One of the best athletes ever out of Annandale was Rob Anderson, rest in peace. He was football quarterback, basketball leading scorer, and baseball, I'm not sure where he was. So those of us that either we just played soccer or we played multiple sports and played soccer in the spring, it was kind of like, what is that sport you guys are playing? Why are you spending so much time on this sport called soccer? But like Brian said, I think we were pretty good, and we drew a lot of players from the Annandale Boys Club, which had a rich soccer history, and Braddock Road Boys Club, and Little River Turnpike Soccer Club, which were pretty young, but also had several good players in them. So we cobbled together a pretty good team. And like Brian said, although we had coaches that were basically volunteer coaches, first Ted Leggett, and then Don Henready, who couldn't be a nicer guy, one of our best friends probably through those years.
Yep. Yep.
They did their best to impart on us and motivate us how to win and how to compete. And we kind of coached ourselves on the nuances of soccer, and the limited understanding we had at that age as well.
Yeah.
There were a couple of players ahead of Brian, and one that went on to play at the University of Maryland that I thought was the best player during my years at Annandale, and that was Tim Reynolds, and just a super creative central midfielder. And then in our years, Brant Vitek and Dan Horton as well, who went on to play at Virginia with us. And there were a few. Tom O'Day was a center back that played at George Mason. So we had some talented players, but the sophistication of both the coaches and the players at that stage was pretty limited.
But it's interesting. Keith and I were lucky enough to witness the Herndon team this year. They'd have, I'd say maybe 1,000, 1,500, but they were loud and boisterous. And in the district where our kids played, Yorktown and Marshall, and Scott caught one of the games last year. I mean, it did have some support, and it's a great sport when you have an audience that's into it. They don't know how to sing songs like the European supporters do, but they do have a lot of enthusiasm. And it's high school games, I think, is gaining a little bit of prominence. So what about you guys? How did you, I know it wasn't as organized and it wasn't as sophisticated, but did it mean a lot to you? Did your high school season mean as much as the club season, even though the level of play might not have been that high?
Scott, you want to go?
Sure, I'll go. Yeah, no, high school back then was definitely second, maybe third seat to club. And I think still today, club rules, right? Back to my high school wasn't very good. We had 5 Division I players on the team.
Is that right? 5?
And we didn't win a district game, if you can believe that.
Wow.
And I think a lot of it had to do with coaching, but also who knows why, but you look back and there were some good programs like UNLV, George Mason, me at Virginia, and yet we weren't a competitive high school team. But I cared, I wanted to win, and especially when I played my teammates from club. So there's that rivalry with, I was more friends with the Robinson guys, but whenever I played Robinson, Lake Braddock, Woodson, it was something special to go up against your club teammates in high school. But
that hasn't changed. Yeah.
Scott, it's all about the goalie. That's what makes the team, right? Yeah, we were, when you get to the high school level, right? I mean, I look at it a little differently than Scott does. For maybe it was just those 4 years earlier, but we really didn't, in everything that we were doing in the club level was geared toward getting into play high school. There really, other than Annandale Boys Club, and Keith can correct me if I'm wrong, but there really wasn't much of a club continuation after you got into high school. So, once I got into high school and started playing, I never went back to play for Little River or Braddock Road. It was just high school. And, I wish, of course now it's very different, but I mean, I don't know if Keith, you had a different experience.
I would say my experience was probably significantly different than both of yours, for 2 reasons. One, I was also playing basketball, and I was pretty successful, and we had a very good basketball team, my class, the class of '82. So during the winter months, late fall and winter, I was committed to basketball and really having a great time. And we had great expectations and big things were expected of us. So while I'd play club soccer in the fall, then I'd be committed to high school basketball in the winter. And then when it came to high school soccer in the spring, I was just coming out of a basketball season where hopefully we had been competitive. We played in the regionals one year, and we were always first or second in the district. So we were performing pretty well. So for me to come into the soccer program, I was already on a basketball high, and soccer was just gravy. I got to play another varsity sport. And the other reason it was unique for me is I played varsity soccer for 3 years. I made the varsity team as a sophomore. And there was a senior in front of me as a goalkeeper, Mike Anton, who's a good goalkeeper. And I had no qualms with him playing. He was a senior. He had paid his dues. I was only a sophomore. And like I said, I was happy with the basketball season I just came out of. And I was working pretty hard, and I was preparing for my junior year. And then one of the other elite goalkeepers in the area transferred into Annandale from Lake Braddock. That's Mike Doherty.
Yep.
He's kind of a legendary goalkeeper in the area. So, and our goalkeeper coach, rest in peace, Fuzzy Dave Williams, was a big fan and a big supporter and trainer of Mike Doherty, and me as well. So I basically didn't play much my junior year either. Mike was definitely the starter. And because I was kind of juggling basketball and soccer, it was like, I guess this is okay. I didn't have a problem with it per se. I thought I could have competed and probably would have, but it was all right. I was getting plenty of varsity sport activity. And then my senior year, I was the starter. And, you talk about some of the role models or idols, even though they were close in age. Brian's class, basically, class of 81 high school, birth year 1963. For me in the area, I really looked up to Mike Doherty. He may have been a 62, but he was a goalkeeper that I admired and tried to model my game after. And Rod Hines, who was at Jefferson High School and Annandale Boys Club, who I thought was fantastic as well. So those two as youth goalkeepers, I really admired and tried to model my game after. And then one that was my own class was at McLean named Craig Signorelli, who went on to play at Notre Dame for a while. And those guys, Mike Benitez over at Bowie, who played at George Mason, I wanted to be like those guys. I wanted to be in that fraternity of goalkeepers that people looked at as being, accomplished goalkeepers, badasses in goal.
There were a lot of guys, Julian, that, the names were dropping. I mean, I know you guys, there was that post, somebody, I think it was Doherty's brother, right? That's on your posts a lot.
Joe Doherty.
Yeah, Joe put that little thing about the all Met team, back in my year. I mean, there were a lot of good players in our area that went on to play college ball. Pretty remarkable.
Well, that's the thing that's it's striking me right now. Scott mentioned 5 Division I players, and they had a losing record. You guys, at least 2 Division I players. Annandale. I'm sure there were more. Nowadays, if you went down the all Met team for boys, if you include honorable mention, I think there were 2 Division I players from the area. I think, and Keith's son was one of them. And there's another one from Osborne. There may have been one more. So out of like 60 kids that were nominated, and Maryland and DC play in the fall, so they weren't considered. But there's not many Division I players now. But obviously, when you guys were playing, there was opportunities for you guys to go play in college. I don't know if that was scholarships or not, but there were at least opportunities to play. Were you guys aware of those opportunities?
I think, for me personally, Julian, I was, but I think there was in my case, there was more of a mental commitment that when I decided that, I was pretty good at what I was doing and that I could go to college to continue playing, then it was, that was my 100% focus. And before the other guys, comment, I just, one of the remarkable things that I didn't really realize then that I do now is, I'm a sophomore at UVA, a second year guy, and in comes Keith Lenert, Danny Horton, and Brant Vitek, all from Annandale High School. So, these are my buddies from high school. So at one point in time, we had 4 starters at UVA that were also playing together at Annandale High School. And that's pretty unheard of today.
Yeah,
I would think.
That was really unique.
Yeah.
Scott and Keith, you want to add to this or?
Go ahead, Primo.
Sure. Well, like I alluded to, I think there were a lot of, a decent number of high quality players in this area during our high school years. Our district, I thought, was very competitive. We had Woodson at the time, I believe, and Brian alluded to Charlie Guevara, who was the class of '81, and he was an extraordinary player, and he went on to play at Duke. Paige Jones, who was class of '82 on that Woodson team, came to UVA with my class. He ended up stopping playing soccer to pursue academics more aggressively, but he was remarkable. Falls Church had one of my best and dear friends and one of Brian and I's old roommates, Craig, aka Coach Myers, was at Falls Church with John Kerr Jr., who played at Duke, Bernard Gray, who played at Clemson, Rick Potts, who played at Delaware and played in the future in the professional league that Scott and I played in.
Yeah.
Jefferson had John Stolmeyer,
Stolmeyer,
national team player.
Yeah.
Nam Ki Hong, Princeton and former professional.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of players, the Tulios.
Yeah.
A lot
Don't
of great
forget
players.
McLean High School, Eric Myron,
Juan Vega, Grant Smith, Gary Smith, Kingsley.
A lot of guys.
Yeah, I think I was, like I said, I was inspired by the pro game. And so I didn't know much about the college game. So it wasn't a thought of, hey, if I do really well, maybe I'll get recruited to go play college soccer. When it came time to it, my senior year, the expectation was I'm going to play soccer in college because that's what I love to do. Some of those players you mentioned, I remember, so I played varsity 4 years, but I didn't play much my first year. But I remember playing against Paige Jones. I wore my socks like Paige Jones wore his socks because I admired him as a player. So there were players that went and played college. I think there was a player at George Mason, Mark Lemaire, possibly. I could have the name wrong, but George Mason did really well in the NCAAs and got a lot of coverage when I was in high school. And so I somehow found this player that I liked. But college soccer wasn't a motivating factor to me, but it became like, oh yeah, I'm going to play college soccer. Then it was like, okay, who wants me? And not many people wanted me. So, so by then it was kind of too late to like prepare yourself to be, going to a specific program or not. And I still remember when I got a phone call from Bruce, and it was quite a surprise that I got a phone call. But once Bruce made that call, the few other schools that I was looking into, I just forgot them and said, "Oh, I'm going to go to the best program."
Yeah. I don't think it's my situation there, and the recruiting was a little different. I was playing basketball and I was getting recruited a little bit for basketball, Air Force Academy, Mary Washington, Roanoke College, and then soccer, because I didn't really play until my varsity year a whole lot. I didn't have a whole lot of interest. Richard Broad at George Mason, Tony Vecchione at George Washington had expressed a little interest. And I don't think it's any secret to at least two of us on this podcast, but Richard Broad really wanted Brian Vernon to go to George Mason, and he recruited him very hard. I mean, Brian racked up 60 or so goals in his last 2 years in high school. I don't know how many he had as a sophomore, but prolific goal scorer in high school and in college. So
I was shocked, BV, I wasn't shocked, like surprised that just the numbers were staggering when I saw your high school stats. Amazing. The
production was remarkable.
Yeah, a little story, Primo. I don't even know if you know this, but when we were playing on Little River, this is, kind of, I guess we were still playing some, I said before I wasn't playing after high school, but I guess we were doing some club stuff because, I don't know what the league was, Julian, but when Bruce first came to recruit me, we were playing at Wakefield Park. and Charlie Guevara was playing, on my squad. And so Bruce was going to come down and kill, two birds with one stone. And he was really probably more interested in Charlie, but
It works.
he was that good. And I remember, Bruce is a young punk, he's only 30 years old, 31 years old at that time. I mean, if you not even thinking of the Bruce Arena we know today. But anyway, he's at Wakefield Park and he talked to us afterwards. And, Charlie was going to be my roommate at UVA. We had already decided that was going to be the case. And it wasn't until after he had committed to UVA that Duke offered him a full ride. And he decided that was in his best interest. So UVA lost a really good player, yeah, for sure.
But you stuck with UVA. So you came there and you was recruiting Charlie, but you maintained your interest in UVA?
Well, I wanted to go there, Julian. I don't know, Keith was talking about Richard Broad, back then, Dick Broad, I mean, great guy, still such a nice guy. But George Mason wasn't the campus that it is today. I mean, there weren't dorms, I think, at that time. It was not an overnight type of college. So there wasn't a lot of interest in there. And Bob Vanderwalker was the coach. I don't know if you remember Bob. He was the coach at James Madison. He was also a ref, which was also one of those very interesting looking back on, where he's the coach at JMU, but he's also reffing your games. And he was, we can talk about a certain party at UVA that he showed up at one night, which is still kind of famous. But, in the end, I think my dad went to UVA for a few years. And when I knew the campus and I knew the program was growing, it certainly wasn't what it was when we left, I think. But Keith mentioned Dave Powell. He was playing at UVA. I had some other people that I knew. So for me, it was a no-brainer. I was going to go to UVA.
Right. Well, guys, we were talking about how you guys ended up at UVA, and none of you guys ended there like some master plan and as a member of Bruce Arenas' team and had these great careers, which you guys all did. It all just kind of happened. Was that typical of that day? I mean, this is a time when, soccer is just, gaining prominence in college programs. So you guys just kind of ended up on the UVA program and had these careers. Do you think that was typical for guys in the area, or do you think your guys' stories were unique?
Primo, I don't know from our perspective, right, for Annandale High School, but I believe, I think in general, Julian, from my perspective, right, when you were a senior in high school and you were looking at college soccer programs, UVA was still, even though they weren't really a top 10 program in the country, they still stood out to me, at least, as a school that I thought was better than most in the area. So for me, that was kind of my thought process in going there. Keith, was there, in your mind, you're a year behind me, was there a different thought process?
I think the attraction of the soccer program was there, but it was a fairly young program and it was on the rise. I think Bruce Arena had been there probably 4 years, Brian, before you went. And I remember going down to Scott Stadium my senior year in high school and watching Brian, my high school teammate and classmate, play in the NCAA tournament, I believe against West Virginia. And Virginia bowed out in that game. That would have been 1981. But there was this aura and this excitement in the stands at Scott Stadium. I mean, it was a 40,000 seat stadium at the time, but it was big time college athletics and it was the NCAA tournament. So it certainly had appeal to me. The school itself had greater appeal to me for academic reasons. And that's why I applied, as well as having attended my junior and senior year in high school. I attended the Easter's celebration because my older brother was at UVA.
Right.
That was like no other party I'd ever seen.
Exactly. I'm sure it still is. They actually ended the Easters. But Scott, you were a little bit younger than these guys, and you had
Right.
4 Division I players on your high school team. The Blue Jays probably had what 10 or so, or 8 or 10. So did those guys end up being recruited, and they got to their college in a more thoughtful way, or did you think it was kind of typical of how it was kind of like the way you ended up at UVA?
So when Brian and Primo were there, they had a lot of success. And so now I'm 2 years after Primo, and I believe Primo, you guys went to the Final Four the year before I got there.
1983.
Yeah.
We lost to Indiana at Indiana.
So now there's a transition there. Well, now Virginia is like the top program in the region, and they're on the rise and rising, and have already gotten some success. So when I was looking, Virginia was like the top program, and I wasn't really thinking about Virginia as being possible. And so when I got that phone call, I was both shocked and excited, because it was the best soccer program that was interested in me, and I wanted to go to not only the best soccer but also the best academics. So I think there was a transition, and I think Brian and Primo were a big part of that. And I think Bruce credits that class that included Jeff Gaffney, which I think was a year after you, BV.
That was Keith. Yep. Primo's year.
That was my class.
Yeah. So as being a really important class for Virginia soccer.
Yeah, Julian, I'm thinking when Scott's saying that, like, what a difference, right? Scott's 3 years after I go in. And when I went there, I don't believe, I think the main reason I'd sum up why I went there is because I could get in. Like, soccer was all I had to do was go and take my SATs and get somewhat decent and sign my name, and they would help me get into the school. So it wasn't that I went into a program that was a top 5 program. They had really struggled to make, I don't think they'd ever made the playoffs, right, Primo? Up until the NCAAs, I mean, that first year. There were some good players, but it was a very different mindset. Do you guys remember, or Keith might, the Apprentice League in Northern Virginia with John Ellis? Does that ring a bell?
The Apprentice team.
Yeah, I remember getting.
It was actually Annandale, but they were referred to as the Apprentices because they kind of tried to bring that English model for kids transitioning from high school.
Right. So I was the inaugural year that the Apprentice League was created. And I remember sitting in my living room with John Ellis and Mr. Germain, right, coming in and sitting down with me and my parents, trying to talk me out of going to UVA, but to play for this Apprentice League, because this was our stepping stone to the NASL, right, which was still at that time going, pretty strong, and there was a lot of buzz. So I don't remember giving it much thought, because I think I just said, soccer, is there any future with it? I also focused on the education, but I just wanted to bring up that Apprentice League. I thought that was pretty interesting.
There is another point that bears mentioning that has been touched on before by Bruce Arena and others, but as I related, when Brian enrolled in the fall of '81, I think Bruce had been there 3, maybe 4 years. But the athletic directors, the athletic department, and the athletic directors in particular were very supportive of Bruce, who really wanted to grow the program and become a national contender. He had this nationally recognized institution that was employing him as both a lacrosse and a soccer coach at the time. And Dick Schultz was a very progressive athletic director that has a fabulous reputation and history. And Bruce went to Dick Schultz and asked for his support. And as I understand it, Dick really supported Bruce and Bruce's interest in attracting top flight players. And that started with Brian Vernon from this area. And then it only grew from there on.
Was Bruce a soccer player himself?
Yes.
He was a goalie. He was a goalkeeper, but he was also the story, and the boys will correct me if I'm wrong, is he was an All-American lacrosse player at Cornell, as well as a All-American goalkeeper at Cornell. I think he was two-sport All-American. So pretty impressive athlete.
That's right. And he does have one cap for the U.S. men's national team.
Okay. So,
So
you know,
Julian,
Yeah.
let me tell an anecdote about what Brian said about being able to get in with soccer's help to Virginia. It was after a practice, and as part of a motivation, Bruce was giving us a speech and trying to motivate us and saying that none of us would be there if it weren't for the athletic department and its influence on admissions. He said, except for one player. And everybody's looking around at who that player might be. And we had pre-med students and very successful, lawn residing, academic reputation players. And Bruce turns and points, and everyone's looking at these players that we all respect and think highly of academically. And while we also think highly of Primo, none of us knew or expected that he was going to point and say Primo. Primo got in to UVA with no athletic influence in admissions, so solely on his academic achievement. And then it all made sense because we all know Primo to be the wise owl that he is. But yeah, so just a funny story. I still remember it to that day, that practice.
So, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, Jeff Lenert maybe, but Keith Lenert, but
It trickled down a little bit.
exactly. Well, you guys have had. I mean, Bruce Arena has had this incredible career. Could you guys have had any indication that he was going to be that kind of coach at the time? I mean, obviously, he didn't know exactly what was going to follow, but was he a guy that was very impressive, and you knew this guy was going places?
I'll start, but I would say no. But as an 18-year-old, to 21-year-old player, I just don't remember Bruce. I think I mentioned this before. As a goalkeeper, and I'm a forward, he wasn't somebody that I looked at and said, "Oh, this guy has all the knowledge." Right? We went to the Final Four. We played well. I think my senior year, my fourth year, we were eliminated by Clemson in the quarterfinals, and we were either the number 1 or number 2 team in the country. I mean, we were supposed to win it all that year, and we lost at home to Clemson. So I don't, Julian. I mean, maybe Keith went back to coach with Bruce, so maybe you have a little different perspective, but I don't know if at that age I had any idea that he was going to, do what he did.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that you can put it under a microscope and figure out how he does what he does, but ever since any of the three of us have known him, he's been nothing but successful, and the trajectory continues. He continues to be successful. Every team he coaches, every program he leads, and I think he's got an uncanny ability to motivate players, and he's got a good eye for talent as well, and getting the most from those players in oftentimes positions that those players might not enjoy playing, but the sum of the parts is always greater, and he's been a master of that.
Yeah. So my comment would be that I've never had the feeling on any of the other teams I've played on that I had at Virginia. Like I felt I would win every time I stepped on that field. And he created that in hindsight. At the time, I maybe didn't appreciate it as much, but I always felt like we were the best team, we were going to win, and that whoever we were playing was inferior to us. I always had that confidence, and I don't naturally have that. I think it all came from Bruce.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that confidence really drove that train, and he demonstrated the confidence in his ability and his staff's ability and in the players that played for him. And it was hard not to be confident if you were in his team or his program.
Well, nowadays we talk about, playing soccer the right way. You play sophisticated soccer. Soccer is one of these sports where you seem to get points if by the way you play. It's not just about the final score, even though maybe it should be. Back then, did you consider tactics, keeping possession? Were those important parts of of the game back then. I mean, as a guy who came to soccer late, I was always surprised at how people worried about how you played. It's just win. I'm a basketball player. No one cares exactly how you win. You just got to win, unless you're holding the ball for the whole game. But other than that, it's just about the result. But anyways, is that a thing you guys thought about back in the 80s?
I don't think so. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I was just thinking when you were saying that, Julian, that, you know, the game has changed so much from when we were there. You know, we were athletic, we were fast, you know, we were everything that, you know, the prototypical American soccer player was, right? We were aggressive. But we played a lot of long balls. You know, it was an era. A lot of people maybe they're listening or will listen to this, you know, where we could play back to the goalie, to Keith, and Keith could pick up the ball, right? So you talk about, you know, knocking the ball around in the back, and then, you know, today he'd have to use his feet, but he could pick up the ball, and we could do that all day long. But it was a lot of for us, we had Gaffney, our second year, which we should mention, you know, Scott said the second year we had this huge influx of players, including Keith, and we talked about Brant Vitek and Danny Horton. But we also had Jeff Gaffney and guys like Rob Stewart, and it was the Mike Schnabel, right? It was a very big recruiting class. And we had some really big guys. So a lot of our strategy was getting the ball out to the touches and then serving the ball into the box and crashing the box. I mean, you know, if we had $1 every time we heard, you know, crashing the box, none of us would have to be retired. So that was much more the style. And the one thing I'll say is I went to a game, you know, a number of years ago with George, when, you know, George obviously has been coaching, and I was talking to George, and I'm like, dude, what are you doing? Why aren't you serving the ball in the box? You know, and he goes, you know, BV, it's all about possession now. It's all about possession. All the stats show it's all about possession. I'm like, man, this is boring. Like, you got to, that was the difference in the game, right? Is we just were very fast paced. We didn't have the skill level that kids have today. And that's kind of the way it worked for us.
Yeah.
When George the program, he was one of the top recruits in the country, and that would have been the fall of 1983. And he joined a front line that included Jeff Gaffney, who was a prolific scorer for all 4 of his years, and Brian Vernon. And Brian was probably the fastest guy on the field, and Jeff was maybe the strongest guy on the field. And Jeff and George were both about 6'2" and 185 or 190 pounds. Brian's 6 foot or 6'1" and fast as lightning. And we lovingly referred to them as the Beef Brothers, because they could really wreak havoc in the penalty box.
Yeah.
And I was maybe 140 pounds, and I came in forward, and I'm looking at these guys going, what is going on? Because I'd never seen guys so big and good. Yeah.
Was the game really physical back then? I mean, is this the time before, when did the yellow and red cards come into soccer?
They were there.
They've always been there.
Still, yeah, they were there, you know, still. I mean, yeah, it was a physical game, Julian. I think if you look at it, when Keith describes George, his nickname, we called him, was Horse. I mean, this guy could run and jump, and, you know, he had that German background, and he could head a ball over anybody. So when really, remember, there's a name that we haven't mentioned, Voga Wallace. I don't know if you remember Voga, Julian. He was the one who really did the flip somersault on the sideline. So one of the first, and flip throw in, I'm sorry. And he was incredibly accurate. So whenever the ball, this is no joke, whenever the ball crossed midfield and it was a throw in, we waited and gave Voga the ball, and he went and did the handspring flip throw in, and that ball would be rocketed toward the goal, and Gaffney and Gelnovich 80% of the time were on the end of it. And so I quickly, when George came on board, my days of being a center forward were well over. I was a winger making things happen, and I was feeding the ball inside. So it was very different. I don't know, Scott, when you were there, if that was, after I left, if that was still the way, we did it, but I'm assuming it was.
I remember slightly different. I think I remember, and Primo, correct me if I'm wrong, I think back then West Germany was a top team in the world. And I have this vague notion that Bruce tried to model his tactics after German style possession and playing in and out. And we used Brandt Vitek a lot as a central midfielder to play the ball in and then out and maintain some buildup and possession, kind of following a German model. I don't know if that.
It kind of became a hybrid because the sport was evolving. When Brian and I started, yes, we were bigger and fast and strong, but with each ensuing year, Bruce was recruiting players that were more technically gifted. And so possession was becoming a more important tactic in our evolution and our strength as a program. And the combination of the size and speed with a smattering of very technical players made us very difficult to match up with. And by the time Scott was there, which you started in 84, is that right, Scott?
84.
We had a handful of very quick and technical players. Jay Del Carmen was one of one. Scott was one. And John Harkes came the following year. John Harkes and Drew Fallon, which were very gifted technical players.
I think the next year when Harksey came was a big year. He was a big recruit, player of the year, and he brought something that was unique, and he was a special player. Back to Voga Wallace, I was in high school and I was watching David Letterman, and Voga Wallace was on David Letterman. And this is before I was going to Virginia, and so he crossed over into popular culture from college soccer with his somersault throw in and with Virginia's success. I think that's the year you guys got to the Final Four.
Voga warrants a couple more anecdotes if you'll indulge me.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, Voga died at about 40 or 41. He was in a Paris airport and he, I believe, had a heart attack. Right. But like Brian and Scott said, he was famous for this flip throw-in. He was from Silver Spring, Maryland, and he could literally turn a throw-in into a corner kick anytime the ball was in your half of the field. He'd throw the ball on a line. It wasn't a looping ball. It was on a line right into the goal box. And it was incredibly dangerous for opposing defenses. So much so that when we played George Mason, which was a nemesis during our early years and actually knocked us out of the NCAA tournament in 2 of my 4 years, but they created a barrier around the perimeter of the field with stake and ropes, about 5, 6, 7 yards away from the touchline to try to preclude Voga from doing his somersault throw-in. So Voga takes the ball, takes 4 or 5 steps on the other side of the rope and does the actual somersault over the rope. So he places the ball over the rope, does his handspring, and launches it. He was just not going to be denied his ability to do that.
That's cool.
Wow.
He was also a hilarious guy to travel with because he was like a Gold Star Amway salesman, so much so that he actually won himself or earned himself a free car during his college years selling Amway products.
That's awesome.
So rest in peace, Voga, man. I miss you.
Yeah, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. If you ever, there's an article up on my wall right now, which was when we were number 3 in the country and we were playing Duke, who was number 1. We were playing at Scott Stadium. What would that have been, Keith? Our second year, maybe your first year? And Sports Illustrated covered the game in their magazine. And so I've got a picture up on the wall with Voga in the position like this with the ball on the ground doing, caught midair, doing his throw-in. And it was a crowd pleaser for sure. No one had ever seen it before.
Yeah.
So as an anecdote, that Duke player in that picture, Brian, if you look at your picture right now.
Yeah.
He was later a Virginia assistant during my years. That's Bob Jenkins.
Oh, that's Jenkins. Okay.
Jenkins.
Yeah.
It's a great picture.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, what about the competition? So did the teams all have distinct styles, or were most teams very practical? Which, I mean, the soccer of that day was practical. I mean, but like, for example, the girls on the UNC side with Anson Dorn's very distinctive way of playing. Even back then, I can remember, I think. But did that affect the boys' side as well?
You would think, Primo?
In I believe the 50s and the 60s, St. Louis was the powerhouse of men's college soccer.
Mhm.
And they still have won more national championships than any other school. I think it's 10.
Mhm.
And Indiana has won 8. Virginia
Mhm.
has won 7. Those are the top 3.
Mhm.
But in our era, certainly Brian in my era, and Scott probably the same, maybe it changed a little bit, but the ACC was the toughest conference in the country by far, in my opinion. And we were always in battles at the top of the conference with Duke
Yep.
and Clemson.
Yep.
And those were the 3 teams that were toughest in the conference. And the last 3 games of the season, for Virginia at least, were spread a week apart. You played no midweek games, and then you played Duke and Clemson for the last 2 games of the regular season. NC State was also very good. And Wake Forest and Carolina were decent at that time as well. But NC State had a big ethnic contingency. I believe a lot of Africans, maybe Nigerians, and
Right.
Clemson also won a lot of, well, they won a lot of ACC conference championships in the late 70s and early 80s with also a fairly ethnic makeup.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I remember Bruce prided himself on being all-American.
Mhm.
I just remember that distinctly. I can't remember if he said it overtly or if just in comments he made about other programs, but there was a sense of pride that we were all U.S. kids and battling it out against these other clubs, other colleges.
Yeah, I don't think my only comment to add to that would be, I remember I think it was our second year. So Primo was there and we played Alabama A&M. And Alabama A&M was all Nigerian. I mean, they were big. I mean, it was 6'1", 6'2", 195, solid rock. And they came into Scott Stadium. Of course, remember, Julian, we're playing on a piece of crap Astroturf football field, right? Every day you walked away with, your thighs, your just raspberries, up and down. From sliding on that stuff. And so Alabama came in and to I think Keith's point earlier, Bruce was a very good motivator and he got us ready to play in that game that we were going to kick their ass. I mean, there was no doubt. And so we went out there and we won convincingly that game. And that was one of the first, I think, games where it really put us on the map as a real strong soccer program. Like, that whole stereotype of, well, you can't play with, these better athletes kind of went out the window. So that was a big turning point.
Yeah.
Julian, to answer the initial question about the style of play, I think in our years at Virginia, because we were predominantly American-born players, and most of the players on Duke were the same, players at Maryland, players at Wake Forest, players at Carolina. Most of those were American-born players. Clemson and NC State were the exception. So they had a lot of ethnicity and therefore probably played with a different style or a different flair, bringing each of their international experiences and backgrounds to those rosters. And NC State had Tab Ramos, who was arguably one of the most technically skilled and gifted American players ever to wear the American crest. So there were lots of them.
Yeah.
And regarding Tab, Bruce, in my phone conversation with him, I remember Bruce thought Tab was coming to Virginia. So he was recruiting Tab highly. And I later learned that because of NC State's assistant coach's connections with, I forget which country, but a foreign country's professional program, that
Uruguay.
was it Uruguay?
I believe Tab's Uruguayan.
Yeah. So they convinced Tab to change his mind and go to NC State. So you imagine if we had Tab Ramos and John Harkes in the midfield,
Mm.
how dominant we could have been. But yeah, Tab was a special player too.
Yeah.
I was so pissed I graduated 1 year too early, Julian. I wanted that last year with Harkes.
Yeah, that's too bad. Well, Brian, you referenced the conditions at Scott Stadium, and I remember going to football games and how hot it was with that sun. And I remember feeling sorry for the running backs when they would get slammed into the concrete surface. What were the playing conditions during those days? And also, compared to today's soccer, where they play in front of these 15 to 20,000 capacity stadiums that are really meant for soccer.
Well, I never got to participate in Klockner, which was built after I left. So, Scott, did you get Klockner at all?
No, but it was brought up before I went there that we were going to have a grass stadium built.
Yeah,
But it wasn't until a couple years after I was gone that I think it got built.
So
we were part of the fundraising machinery.
Yeah. What's interesting, Julian, is the practice field, which was next to the track, at the U-Haul, right up on the hill. There was a track that, cross country ran. Next to that was the practice field. That was grass. So our first year, I don't know if Keith realizes this, we played on that field. That was our home field. So it was a grass field. You would, as I often did, I'd hit a ball 20 yards over the goal and it would run down into the street, and all the ball boys and girls would have to go chase it down as it's traveling down toward 29. But it wasn't until our second year that we went to the stadium and we started playing Keith's first year. And it was, it was brutal. It was a competitive advantage for us in many ways because other teams did not play on Astroturf. So that's kind of my memory. The only other thing I'll say, which I think is, I tell this story all the time, is you can imagine, Julian, playing in front of an average of 500, 700 people. Now put all of those people in Scott Stadium, which at the time probably had 46,000 capacity, right? So when we had that game against Duke that I talked about earlier, we had an audience of about maybe 7,000 to 10,000 people, somewhere in there. It was a big deal. It was number 1 versus number 3. It was about U.S. soccer. But I do remember they moved everybody away from the visitor side and packed everybody onto the one side of the field so it would look, when the cameras, because it was on film, right? One of the few early games that we were televised, it looked like there was actually a pretty big crowd. So pretty interesting.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that? That's one thing that's distinctive about that time period. Whenever you see pictures of the soccer games, you always see kind of the empty stands in these huge stadiums. And I don't think it does justice to the emotion that was in the game, but those are just the pictures that are left with us.
I don't think we had Primo. How many did we have on average at a game?
I think the students would come out and all our parents that were local would travel up and down from Jersey to Maryland. So I don't know, we'd average probably between 500, maybe 500, 700 for big games. Like Brian said, Duke games, Clemson games. At times we'd get several thousand, up to 5 or 6. That wasn't very often though. And like Brian said, the synthetic turf at Scott Stadium was abhorred by all our opponents. Not to say we loved it either, but it gave us a distinct advantage, having trained on it all year, or at least the day or two before the game. And no fail, the 4 years that I was there, Clemson came to visit twice. And every time their coach, I am Ibrahim is his name. He passed away a few years back, but he was irate because he claimed that it did not meet the minimum width standards. So every time they stepped off their bus, he would go out there and he'd pace it off and just shake his head because it made it, but it barely made it. I think 68 or 69 yards.
Love it. Love it. How about when it was,
Yes.
playing in the rain?
Especially for a goalie. It must
Oh
be
my
tough.
God, the ball would skip
So fast.
just ridiculously. Yeah.
What was the relationship between the players and the university and the rest of the students? Like if the football players would strut around and they would go to the rugby road and they were like gods. The basketball team, it was right, Brian. I think you're doing the Ralph Sampson in the Ralph Sampson years, so they were kings and number 1, 2, 3 in the nation often. But the soccer team, were you guys kind of just like like regular students, or were you treated somehow differently?
You guys take that one.
I think we had a certain degree of respect from both other student athletes, and the student body, because our record was always very good. So we were certainly one of the winningest programs during that era. Yes, basketball was pretty good, but soccer in those years and most years since then has always been very good in terms of results and standing. So we had the respect, and we had our fanatical group of student friends. There was probably 100 or 200 that never missed a home game, and they'd always be at the same social events. So I think people appreciated that we were a good team. We represented the university well.
Yeah.
God, what about you? Anything else on that?
Yeah.
I just remember if you had a UVAA sweatshirt, even if they didn't know what sport you played in, there was a little bit of respect of some kind. But I'm bummed. I missed top Virginia basketball because Primo, correct me if I'm wrong, Final Fours the 2 years prior to my year, I think. Julian, is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's true. They went there with either Final 8, and I think maybe NC State upset us.
Yeah.
And then we went to the Final Four the yeur after Ralph
Right.
graduated. But I don't know if Ralph
That would have been 82, I think.
What's that?
No, Final Four was also Jimmy's. I know you interviewed Jimmy Miller, who was my roommate, Julian, for a number of years. And it was, Rick Carlisle's, if you remember, Rick Carlisle, transferred in. Once Ralph had left, they went, and that was the year they played Houston in the Final Four.
Oh, that's right, they did.
Jimmy was MVP. So, but I will say, back to your original question, Julian. I lived with Jim Miller, so I experienced that basketball hysteria at, just incredible levels. And I actually look back on it now, and I think, how lucky was I that I attended the university during a couple of the Ralph Sampson years. And as a student athlete, I was able to get tickets every single game at UVA. And I still vividly, fondly remember those games. And I think it's a memory I'll have for the rest of my life.
ACC basketball tickets was one of the perks of being an athlete at Virginia.
Yeah. And Jimmy, I'm sure when you interviewed him, he'd tell you when they always put him on Michael Jordan, right? So, imagine the players that we saw come through, but we had our own Ralph Sampson, which, was just incredible. So great era to be involved in any athletics at the university. I don't care if we were peon soccer players.
Exactly.
I think most of the athletes got along pretty well, and we were interacting with one another routinely at U-Haul or in the training room and whatnot. So we all supported one another. Basketball seemed to be the most separate because it's really only a group of 12 or 14 players. And Brian living with them kind of was a connection between the soccer team and the basketball team. The other sports, I knew lots of football players and got along with them well. I had plenty of lacrosse players and wrestlers in my dorm. So we had a natural relationship and affinity for each other's teams. So I think we all supported each other and really respected one another for being student athletes at UVA.
Yeah.
My second year, they built the athletic dining facility too. So prior to that, it was the regular dining halls, but second year, it was, I forget the name of it, but right there at Scott Stadium, was the athlete dining facility. So you saw athletes from all different sports and mingled with them there. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But let's face it, if you weren't basketball or football, if you weren't a revenue sport, right, it was just a different level, Julian. It's just, and rightfully so. They were big time.
Yeah.
The dining facility is Bryant Hall.
Right.
Brian,
Yeah.
I missed that.
I do too.
Yeah. Well, you guys got Ken Johnson's for some meals.
Yeah.
I missed that also.
KJ's. Hey, and let me tell you, Julian, the number one advantage to being an athlete is you could get into TJ's and avoid the line on the corner, because usually it was like Mike Caravana or one of the lacrosse players working the door. So that connection was worth its weight in gold.
While we're on the student athlete meal discussion, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention preseason getaway at Graves Mountain Lodge.
Yeah.
Always took like a 1 or 2 day respite where you got away from grounds and got a break from the 2-a-day preseason to go and relax in the swimming pool or the game room at Graves Mountain Lodge, and got a fantastic home cooked meal. Table tennis, billiards.
yeah.
Well, didn't someone mention that you guys were just playing one game a week? Is that the way the schedule was back then? But
it was mentioned, I think, by Primo that at the end of the season for those big games,
okay,
Bruce scheduled
okay.
so that we didn't have the midweek game.
I got
But
it.
during the regular season, there was usually a midweek game,
Okay.
oftentimes against a lesser opponent, and then the big game was the weekend game. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Primo, I think it was 2 games a week for the majority of the season. But then towards the end, when it was Duke and Clemson, it was a week apart.
That's
So
correct.
So you still had the compressed season that they have today. One of the challenges that I'm sure Matthew Leonard's going to go through now. You go to a college campus and your first week there, you're in the middle of either preseason or your first couple games, and you have this compressed season where you're playing twice a week, and if your team continues to win, you may be playing into December. I'm not sure if it was like that for you guys. And then in the spring, you can finally relax a little bit and live the life of a student, but yet you still had some spring game. You have some spring games now. It's like a 4 or 5 game season, a 6 game season now. Did you guys have the same type of season where you guys would have a busy fall, but also play games in the spring?
I remember a couple, right? I remember I don't remember being a strenuous schedule in the spring. It was really more to keep yourself, somewhat fit. I mean, I think, I might have been working a bartender job in the spring, down on the corner. So, I mean, there wasn't, I don't think the focus, Julian, like there is today is, I'll let the other guys respond though.
Like Brian said, when we were playing, the spring season was pretty relaxed. We would get together and train several times a week. There were a couple of dates where you'd have scrimmages or exhibition games, maybe against a more local institution, university or college, but it wasn't all that demanding. And I will say, when I went back as an assistant coach, it had changed. And that was 96, I believe, when I went back. And the spring season was more rigorous, still less than the fall, but more rigorous in terms of the training, the discipline, and you had players that were hungry to gain playing time or to beat you out in your position. And the recruiting had ramped up considerably. So the coaching staff was always trying to get the best players. So the next wave of players coming in was damn well going to fight for their time too. So you had to keep it in check and really be working at your trade.
Mm-hmm.
That was the mid to late 90s.
You had already come in, Primo. They had already won 5 national championships, right?
4. And that was part of my motivation and interest. I was like, damn, how come I didn't get a national championship?
Yeah.
We lost in the semifinals at Indiana. Then we lost in the quarterfinals at home to Clemson. And it was like, man, we deserved a championship. Well, I won't say we deserved it. We didn't win it. but
Yeah.
we were in the hunt to win one. And then when Bruce left for Major League Soccer and George Gelnovich was elevated from the associate head coach to the head coach, he needed a goalkeeper coach. And I was thinking about getting back into college coaching. And I was like, why not? I need to go back and win a national championship. I guess I forgot an integral part here. In 1989, they were co-champions for the first time
Yes.
with Santa Clara.
Yep.
And I attended that game at Rutgers in the freezing cold. And then in 1991, 2, 3, and 4, they won 4 in a row. So you're right, Brian, it was 5.
Yeah.
5
5.
over 6 years.
Yeah.
And I went back and said, I can get one of these. And we made it to the final and lost to UCLA. It's heartbreaking.
Ugh.
You
So
know,
He made some.
go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, in that '89 co-champion team, there were teams of mine that I had played with, the younger crew. And it's funny, I actually just came across the article again, where my third year, which was 1986, we were the best team in college soccer, but we got beat by Loyola on a set piece, and then they parked the bus for 90 minutes. But I came across an article the next year where Bruce said, I will go to my grave saying we were the best team in college soccer that year. But like, the best team doesn't always win.
Yeah.
And then later I was so jealous of the class that went for 4 years, never lost a playoff game. That's just incredible, because it was also more competitive.
Yeah.
So in a more competitive environment, they were that successful. And I remember going back for a alumni game where I got to play against some of those players. It was at Klockner, so I actually got to play on Klockner. It was a special treat.
Interesting.
And Julian, you interviewed Nate Friends, who was one of those players.
Yeah.
And they were loaded. Claudio Reyna, they had so many players.
Nate had 4. He's one of the players, right, that got 4 in a row, which is incredible. I was just gonna, maybe some of the viewers, Julian, won't understand that before the NCAA tournament was in, North Carolina, right, some kind of neutral site, Keith and I had to travel to St. Louis to play Indiana, right, or Indiana, excuse me, for the Final Four on their field, on their home field, because back then it was who could draw the most people.
Yeah.
And so we went there. I guarantee the weather, it was rainy, it was maybe sleeting, it was in the upper 30s, maybe it hit 40. It was not ideal conditions to play soccer. We're playing on their home field. So we ended up losing that game, like, I don't know, it was either 2-1 or 1-0. I can't remember what the final was, but we were obviously super disappointed.
What do you think the difference was? Obviously, they had Nate Friends and Claudio Reyna, but you guys had talented teams as well. And as Scott said, the game had progressed by the time the early '90s teams won their 4 in a row. What was the difference between the teams in the '80s and the teams in the early '90s that were able to break through?
I've kind of lived in this soccer universe most of my life. And I attended several of those championship games. And I would say my experience at UVA, we had a lot of very, very good players, some great players. I wasn't traveling the entire country to see all the players at other institutions, although we did get to go to California my second year, and we played against UCLA, I think, and USF. So we got to see a number of those teams, but not on a regular basis. So I thought we had lots of very good players, lots of very good athletes. But I think as the years passed, Virginia had elite players with elite technical ability and athleticism at virtually all positions. And it was really hard for other schools to compete with them. I mean, I can rattle off all those names, and those players were extraordinary. AJ Wood is still one of the leading scorers in UVA history. Lyle Yorks, Damian Silvera, rest in peace, Damian. Ben Crawley, Brandon Pollard, Clint P.A. They were just loaded. Kurt Anolfo, Lyle Yorks, if I said Richie Williams, all household names for soccer players that watched the early years of Major League Soccer. Jeff Agus,
Yeah,
Brad Agus.
incredible
So-
player.
Yeah. Well, guys. So the NASL, I believe, is wrapping up about the time you guys are getting out of school, or at least it's definitely losing prominence. So, what are good soccer players doing? Are you guys looking at European opportunities at all, or is it basically people are beginning to realize that our very high level soccer careers is coming to an end?
Can I take that one first, guys, since I'm the elder statesman? So the NASL folded, Julian, in '84. So I graduated. That was the last season, right? So if in the Diplomats, we talked about this in our previous session, the Washington Diplomats actually folded in '81 as the team that we know. So the writing was on the wall. But for a guy, I went down, I was selected to play in the Senior Bowl. I don't know if they do that still, but I went down to Florida. It was a great, honor to go down and play. But I remember being down there with guys like Eric Myron, who we mentioned before, played at McLean and played at UConn. And it's interesting because at that point in time, you pretty much knew that unless you were, really dedicated to the sport and you wanted to try to go to Europe, or you wanted to play in the MISL, which was Major Indoor Soccer League, which, I was like a fast forward. I wasn't a super technical ball skill guy. So indoor soccer, never had an interest for me. But I remember after the game, this is to put it in perspective, the state of American soccer, the league is folding. I remember after the game, one of the MISL scouts came up to me. I think it was from, Houston or Dallas, maybe Dallas, I think was a team at that time. And they said how interested they were in me and they wanted me to come and try out for the team. And they said, listen, all you need to do is go book your own flight and make all your arrangements. And if you make the team, we'll reimburse you. So I kind of at that point said, I think I've got a career in other things that are going to pay me a little bit more money. So that was kind of U.S. soccer in 1984, to put it in perspective.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah. I don't know. Primo did some other things though, and so did Scott.
Well, during Brian's years that he's referring to, the NASL folded officially in 84. And as far as local players that actually went on that were so committed to the sport and pursuing it as a profession, John Stolmeyer went to Indiana and he's from Jefferson High School and he played for the national team. And one of the schools in the ACC that was not that strong during our years, they were okay, but that was the University of Maryland. And Desmond Armstrong from Maryland played at the University of Maryland and went on to play for our national team. But other than that, we could probably name the 5 or 6 guys that actually blazed a career or a short-lived career in Europe on this video. I think Dale Irvine from UCLA made it for a while. The guy that was the most prolific player and scorer on our team, Jeff Gaffney, was barely, if ever, called into the U.S. national team training camps. Head coach at the time was, I believe, a Greek guy by the name of Alki Panagoulis, if I'm saying that correctly. And I only heard once or twice at training over my 4 years any inquiry or chat about Jeff Gaffney being invited to a national team training camp. And the guy scored I think 68 goals over 4 years at UVA.
But Primo, you know what though? When Jeff was coming into the program, just a little anecdote about that. When he was coming in, when he played, he had a short stint with the national team. They had him as a defender. They had
Oh,
him as right back. So he didn't, Jeff was a big guy. He was solid. He was, good in the air, but he didn't fit the model of what they were looking at. So we did, before UVA, we did a lot of the Eastern regional camps and competed, nationally. But yeah, Jeff was playing on the national team for a short stint as a right back. So imagine that. Prolific goal scorer, right back.
so the point is, I don't think many of us in the UVA program in the early, maybe even the mid ladies, Scott, saw a pathway or an opportunity to a future as a professional soccer player.
You had your unicorns, and Harkes was the one from my class that had success overseas, and there was no other thought about anybody else. You had your one or two special players. That was it. But you're right. I remember losing the last playoff game, thinking this is it. This is the last time I'm going to play competitive soccer. Which was sad. But then Primo gave me a phone call a year later. So.
Well, let's talk about how you guys got involved in playing at least semi-pro, and I think I guess you can call pro soccer in at least in America, right?
Yeah, well, so I took a fifth year at UVA to finish my degree. And in that fifth year, I served as a undergraduate assistant. And one of the guys that had been a assistant coach while I was there in my first year was Paul Malone. And he was an All-American player at Princeton, and he was at UVA Darden School for his MBA. And Paul's case study, I believe, was to build this soccer distribution company. And he actually brought that to fruition. It was first Soccer Supplies of Northern Virginia, which had just soccer equipment and gear.
I worked there.
Yeah. And then they bought the rights to distribution of Diadora soccer and tennis stuff in the United States. And when I finished at UVA, I went to work for Paul and his brothers. And there was really no professional league at that time. This was 1986. And the US Open Cup, which is a competition, the oldest competition in this country, and is open to any team from any professional, semi-professional, amateur league. It's the highest level of competition for adults at that time. And there was a team out of Washington, D.C. called España, Club España. And it was consisted mostly of American university players, but lots of other players from the area as well. And they had won the Amateur Cup and they had won the US Open Cup, either in the same year or in consecutive years. And then there started to be this, interest and traction about starting a professional league again to try to create a professional soccer environment. NASL had been defunct because of overspending now since 1984. And this is now 1987, 1988. And I believe it was 10 initial teams and franchises on the East Coast decided that they were going to make a run at a professional league. They named it the American Soccer League, which I believe was the second or third iteration of the American Soccer League. And they launched with 10 teams. And the Washington Diplomats happened to be one of those teams. And the coach was a player coach on that Club España amateur championship team, which was Ian Bain, who played on 2 Howard University NCAA championship teams in the 70s. He was the coach, and he was close friends with the Malone brothers at Intersport Limited, where I worked. So I was still pretty young, and I was still fit, and I was still playing in men's leagues. And I went out for that team, and I made that team. So I was on the Washington Diplomats roster for that inaugural year of the American Soccer League in 1988.
You remember what they paid you, Primo?
It was a couple $100 a game. But it also kept me off the streets on Friday and Saturday night. So it was really like double that.
Yeah.
But we had a good team, and I, really embraced it and enjoyed that team. And I had 2 friends actually that were very good quality soccer players. And one was Nam Ki Hong, of
Mhm.
Princeton University, a Thomas Jefferson High School graduate, who had been playing soccer professionally in, I think, Ireland or Northern Ireland, and also his native country of Korea, South Korea. And he was coming back to the United States. And he reached out to me and wanted to know about this team. And I also was good friends with Scott Platenberg, who I had overlapped with as a player at UVA for 2 years. Then during my 5th year, I was with Scott again for his 3rd year, right? Yes, 3rd year.
Yeah.
And we stayed in touch and always had a close relationship. And I had been going to training regularly, and a lot of quality players, good team, but certainly room for another dedicated player like Scott. Good, honest, clean living player, works his tail off, plays wherever you need him to play, and is just a ferocious competitor with a lot of talent and heart of gold. And I reached out to him and asked him if he'd be interested in coming out. And I think I kind of persuaded and coerced him to do so. And then I had 2 of my close buddies with me, and we were driving from day jobs to RFK for training every day after work. We ended up going 10-10 in the regular season, finishing 2nd in our conference, which qualified us for the 4-team playoff. And we went on to win it all against the Fort Lauderdale Strikers in the final.
Oh, that's
So
cool.
the inaugural year, we won the championship.
That's great.
So as I remember it, and I was on a club team we talked about earlier that won the McGuire Cup. And in the magazines that I have about the Kick magazine, it shows that Club España won, I believe it might have been the Amateur Cup that same year. And so it's interesting to see back their success. They were just a little bit older, but also very successful. Michael Brady was on that team from American. But yeah, so I think I got a phone call from Primo. There had been a shakeup in the team. I think the team was maybe 3-6 at the time, and they're looking to change things. And so they added me and a player that I had played with in the Open Cup for a Fairfax Spartans Greek restaurant team that these guys know. Well, anyway, so they added 2 or 3 players to that team, but I think they also, and Primo, I think they established Primo as the goalkeeper, and I don't know if he was sharing time prior to that. But when I came in, there seemed to be some friction between now the backup keeper and Primo had established himself, and I think it turned the team around. So from 3-6, we went to 9-6. And like Keith said, we then got into the playoffs at 10-10 after another shakeup that wasn't a positive one. But we got into the playoffs, and Primo was exceptional. We played, the number 1 team was New Jersey, and that had our former teammate George Gelnevach on it, as well as the top leading scorer in the league. And we beat them in a dramatic mini game, which they had after the I can't remember if we won the first game at RFK, which was another cool thing about not only it being called the Washington Diplomats, but we played at RFK Stadium. So our locker room was the Redskins locker room. It was just, an awesome thing for a bunch of Northern Virginia kids. But we beat the top team, and then we played the Fort Lauderdale Strikers for the championship. And there were World Cup players on that team that you would know. Ray Hudson was on that team. Kubias was on that team. I'm going to forget who all was on that team, but it was the established former NASL and World Cup players against this scrappy 10-10 Diplomats team. But we brought it to them, and we also had exceptional goalkeeping, and we won that first ASL championship. It was memorable. It was awesome. Yeah.
So in that league, as Scott mentioned, Teofilo Nene Cubillas is a Peruvian and global soccer legend, played in World Cups, has a World Cup reputation. He was on that Fort Lauderdale Strikers team, as was Ray Hudson, who was an incredibly gifted and skillful player and quite the character, as we all listened to him on Sirius XM. Ken Fogarty, another English guy, Steve Kinsey, Marcelo Carrera, Ricardo Alonso, Arnie Mauser in goal. So they were household names in the soccer
Ron
world.
I think was Ron
Thomas
John.
Rongen.
Oh, yeah.
And like Scott said, we were kind of a ragtag bunch from a lot of American university players, several UVA players, a national team player from El Salvador named Joaquin Canales, Michael Brady, who was American College Soccer Player of the Year in '85, I think. So we had a good team. We could compete, and we did compete. And we had the good fortune of winning in a 2-leg series. And we won the second leg down at Fort Lauderdale. But that league, it doesn't get much coverage and publicity over the years, but it was an interim league between the NASL and Major League Soccer. And it had genuine, earnest investors and owners trying to prop up a league to create an environment to play. I mean, the Washington Stars, our fellow Washington franchise, was owned by John Koskinen, who is a household name in the Washington circles and in the Duke University circles. The stadium at Duke is named after him. And coincidentally, I ran into him this past week at the Georgetown Duke exhibition match, and we chatted for about 10 minutes. It was great to catch up with him. So, but Cubillas was in that league. De Brito was in that league. Ozzy Ardiles was in that league briefly. He's an Argentine legend. Paul Mariner, who is an English legend, and a lot of U.S. national team players, John Harkes, Tab Ramos, Eric Eichmann, Desmond Armstrong. So it was a decent league. We enjoyed it. It didn't pay much, but it was quite a ride. In 1988, it was quite a ride.
You got a couple $100, Primo. I'm surprised to hear that. I'm bummed.
I'm probably owed a couple hundred still.
But yeah, those were lean years, Julian, in American soccer history, right? It was regional leagues that were trying, they were trying to establish themselves. I came out to the West Coast the following year. My now wife waited that summer for me while I played soccer with Primo, kind of impatiently because we were supposed to come out here. We came out here, and then I played on a Western Soccer League team called the San Diego Nomads. And so these were regional teams owned by our club out here was owned by a restaurateur. And with the hope that they would grow into being the top flight league in anticipation too of hosting the World Cup, because the requirement, at least thought of at the time, was that you had to have a level 1 professional league in order to host the World Cup. And so there were all these owners that were jockeying and trying to position themselves to be in that top league. And Primo probably knows more about the details of it, but I think they made an exception for the '94 World Cup and allowed the U.S. to host despite not having that league. We played, so the Nomads, we won our championship in 1989, and they had what they called the inaugural American Professional Soccer League Championship that pitted the West Coast team and the East Coast champion, which the next year, after the Diplomats won, the Fort Lauderdale Strikers were the champions in 1989. So we played out here in San Jose for this APSL championship. And there was one more year, and then our team folded. And many of the Western Soccer League, now APSL West teams, folded because that hope and that promise of becoming a top league fizzled out and didn't materialize. But yeah, so 1990, that's now World Cup in 94 and MLS in 96. So there was a stretch there where it was pretty rough.
Yeah.
Well, so Scott has the distinction of winning 2 professional championships on each of the coasts in back-to-back years.
Exactly.
Pretty exceptional.
Very impressive.
One little anecdote about the American Soccer League on the East Coast. Its commissioner was none other than Chuck Blazer. So after we won the championship, Chuck Blazer was at our dinner table celebrating kind of with us.
That's cool. Yeah.
Um,
Well, Brian, I know you went right to work after UVA, so you didn't chase whatever pro dream was out there. But I understand you scored goals well into your 50s playing in men's leagues.
I do. I still believe it or not, Julian, I still get out there every once in a while. Now, there's a little known league that maybe these two down in my screen below don't know. It's called the Latin American Soccer League, and it was thriving in the Boston area. So when I left UVA, I ended up in Boston, and I played in this LASA league. And so that was my $200 under the table every time I showed up to play. So that's all I got.
Excellent. I did not know that.
Yeah, I still play in the men's league today. I'm kind of winding up. The knees have finally started to give me a little bit of trouble. But soccer is one of those great sports, unlike football, that you can actually play into your 50s and even 60s if you stay in shape. So I still do it a little bit. I still scored some goals, but I think those are in the rearview mirror, Julian.
Yeah. Well, you lasted certainly longer than I did in basketball, and so to be out there taking the pounding on your legs it's very admirable. Well, one thing I would think, guys, is that soccer was becoming this incredible participation sport in the early 90s, especially, and it's just escalated from there. But we didn't have generations of coaches in this country, so you would think there had been great opportunities for coaching right about the time you guys are getting out of school, but just more and more over time. Look at the girls' side where there's Joe Ellis, there's Sue Montaigne, there's Barbara Wickstrand, my classmate at Robinson. So many women, Julie Cunningham from Lake Braddock, all became Division I coaches. I know Keith dabbled in some coaching, coached at UVA, but you guys didn't seem to pursue coaching as a career. And it seemed like there probably would have been some opportunities out there if you were so inclined. So what did you guys think about coaching when you got out of UVA?
I never thought about it personally. Just I was thinking business, and I was a comm school grad at UVA, and coaching. Looking back, I've often thought like, wow. I mean, there's some great opportunities there at the college level, but I never thought about it. But I know Keith had some. Scott, I don't know if you ever coached at all. So
No, I only coached, my kids and rec and competitive soccer a little bit. But no, it's funny. I didn't see, there wasn't like a model of getting into coaching that I recognized, at least. And when I was playing club, it was volunteer dads, and it wasn't until later where I had like really professional level type coaching. But I never saw that for me for some reason. I look back on it and think that would have been really cool because I'm passionate about the sport. But I graduated the engineering school. When I was out here in Southern California, I was starting my engineering career and also playing at the same time. And so coaching never really entered into it. And it's unfortunate because I think it would have been a pretty cool way to go.
Yeah. Only one of us, Julian, has remained in soccer pretty much their entire career.
Yeah.
We know who that is.
Yeah.
Like I said, I did a 5th year as an assistant coach when I finished my undergraduate degree. And then I went into the business world for about 7 years, and I had the itch to get back on the field. And I had recently played a couple of professional years with the Diplomats. So I was still immersed in the culture. I was working for a soccer sporting goods distributor, playing on a pseudo-professional team, and I enjoyed it. I loved being around soccer. I loved being around sports. So I jumped at the opportunity to go back to UVA as an assistant coach. And I was there for 3 years, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I was still young enough that I could get on the field and play with the team. And I would do that occasionally. And then my body started failing me a little bit. and, dealing with some debilitating pain and whatnot, then dragging myself out to the pitch for several hours each day became a labor that, I just wasn't loving. And I didn't need to train with the team, but it's really what I enjoyed doing and demonstrating and stuff like that. So I probably could have pursued coaching and just resigned myself to the sideline or the chalkboard or what have you, recruiting, all that stuff, which I had done some of. But I really wanted to be on the field and physically able. And when I decided that wasn't going to happen, I decided to try to marry my love for sports and my degrees in economics. So I wanted to marry business, discipline, and sports. And they were just getting traction to develop the Maryland Soccerplex at the time. And that was brought to my attention through a couple of close friends. And I interviewed for a job there. And I've been there for 24 years since then.
A legend.
Yeah.
And I still do coach my sons a little bit in
Yeah.
a healthy fashion at home.
Exactly. He coaches it from the sidelines in a healthy fashion. Look, guys, one thing I also wanted to know is, do you ever look back on it and wish you had the opportunities that players today have? I mean, was there something very special about being kind of like, I don't want to say pioneers, because as Keith said, St. Louis was, winning championships 20 years before you guys played, or 30 years before you guys played. But you guys were still on the kind of the cutting edge, and soccer was becoming this very popular sport in America. Do you ever wish you would have played in today's game when soccer is much more exposed to the general population? There's many more opportunities to play in college, even though you guys played at the highest level. Is there any sense of that?
For me, definitely. I mean, I think, Julian, it's more about the training and the way the game is taught today that wasn't taught to me. I relied on athleticism, and quite frankly, I relied on speed. I was a fast guy. I could outrun a lot of folks, and we played a lot of through balls. And if I got to it first, I had a nose for the goal. But what I didn't have, and I think probably all of us just watched Messi, with Inter Miami, right, in that championship game. And what always makes me so envious is the way they finish, is the precision in which they can put a ball in any corner. I think about, you see all the little videos come up on TikTok or Instagram, all the kids practicing, and they're just shooting at targets. I mean, there's so much more, instead of me going up to my elementary school and banging a ball up against the wall. And just, that was about the extent of it, right? So I think for me, it's, I wish I had the training, because I think if I was playing today, I still had the athleticism, but I'd have that incredible skill set to go along with it, which, could have made a difference.
Yeah. Keith or Scott, you want to try this one?
I don't really have any regrets about the pathway I pursued. I did have what I would say was a remote opportunity that I was probably too young or too naive to recognize. During the American Soccer League year in 1988, we had obviously won the championship, and I had had a pretty good year and a pretty good final. And I was asked to go on a tour with, I don't know that they'd call it an all-star team, but a selected group of players from the American Soccer League to go on a tour. And I don't remember if it was Ireland or Scotland, but I was one of two goalkeepers asked to go. The other, I believe, was Winston DeBose. And I was only getting a couple $100 a game, if I was lucky, if we won a couple hundred. And I had a nagging shoulder injury. And I also had a 9-to-5 job with Intersport Limited in the Malones that I had only been in for probably a year or so. And I saw that as my professional career track. And I declined that opportunity. And I sometimes wonder where it may have taken me, where it may have led had I been healthy and taken the advantage of that opportunity. And do I certainly think that all three of us would have enjoyed an opportunity to play in today's soccer industry? Absolutely. You know, they look like they're having so much fun. We're all passionate supporters and watchers. It would have been wonderful to be able to step from the UVA college soccer experience into a strong, well-established, comfortably paying soccer professional career. Sure, why not?
And not to mention those horrible grass fields you guys played on in high school.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
I have some mixed thoughts about it. I was a bit of a late bloomer. So one of my thoughts is, oh my gosh, I may not have been able to be recognized or achieve the levels that I did eventually, because things are so competitive now and athletic now. I think BB probably wouldn't have had the problem that I had. You were a top athlete. I wasn't a top athlete until I got to Virginia and saw what a top athlete was, right? So part of me thinks, oh my gosh, I may not have had the same level of success, but I had that passion. And so that passion in a better environment, I'm curious, like how that would have gone, you know, where that could have taken me. I did have an experience where out here with the Nomads, we scrimmaged a professional team from Germany's Bundesliga, the Bayer Leverkusen. They would vacation out here after their season. And I got to play against them twice. And so I got to play against top level pros, granted on vacation, twice. And I remember one of them was quoted as saying, we were like fourth division soccer players.
Yeah.
And I imagine it would have been pretty hard to scrap out a living playing fourth division soccer back in the day. So, yeah, I do envy this generation. You know, there's soccer on TV all the time. There's a infrastructure. I do admire their level of play. And I wonder where my passion and what would have happened for me in that environment back in the day. But yeah, I have a little regret like Primo has. I had one experience that I said no to, and that was we had lost in the NCAAs, and coach was bringing us team down to Florida over Thanksgiving holiday, and didn't think that the Virginia guys would be available because we weren't supposed to lose. Yeah. And so he called me up the night before Thanksgiving and said, "Hey, if you can make it, I've got a ticket for you. Come on down." And I chose family over soccer once. And it was that time. And I learned that they selected a team from that tournament and they traveled to Europe for some exhibitions. And so I always wonder, you know, what if I said yes to that? You know, what could have happened from there? But other than that, and that's just a minor regret. No regrets. Love that era. Love that I had the opportunity. Grateful to Bruce Arena for inviting me, for letting me, come to Virginia. Thankful for the opportunity. Great school, great people like you guys. Just very, very thankful.
Yeah. Hey, Julian. Well, Scott discounts his athleticism a little bit, and I think my recollection is pretty good. And as a goalkeeper, not typically the most fit or endurance-oriented runner on the team. I think we all dread, even to this day, and I can tell you about my son's experience too, the fitness test on the first day or two of preseason. Everybody is a little anxious about that, no matter how good an athlete, no matter how fast or fit you are. And for us, it was always the Cooper run, which was you were supposed to finish 2 miles in 12 minutes. And if you couldn't do it, you were supposed to run it again the next day until you made it. So that was a pretty daunting thought for a goalkeeper. Endurance was not my forte.
Impossible.
When Scott rolled into town in '84, that Cooper run was still being done by Bruce and the staff. And I'm pretty certain Scott finished 1 or 2 of our 22, 23, 24 man roster. And he was exceptional at that run, fitness test. And another guy was a teammate of ours, certainly Brian and mine, and I think Scott's for 1 year, was Keith Meyer. His nickname was Rookie. and he was
Yeah.
from Fleetwood, Pennsylvania, and he could run like the wind too. He was a central midfielder that was very good for us, but in that Cooper run, he may have lapped me. He could just run like the wind, and Scott did too. Who did you finish second to, Scott?
So that was my second year, right? Because I showed up naive and clueless my first year, but my second year, yeah, because I had role models like BV, I had people to see like what athleticism was.
Scott, BV was probably puking by the senior year running that thing. It was ridiculous. Julian, imagine sprinting for 8 laps around a track.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
That was what it was. And you got young guys like Scott, lapping the field, and I'm just, it was crazy. Who the hell came up with that thing?
A midfielder did. That's not a striker's fitness test. That's a midfielder.
Not a chance.
As difficult as it was, Bruce learned later that a better measure of fitness was at 300s. So for my last 2 years, rather than the Cooper run, we ran Prima. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
We ran 300s, and there were more players puking after that than there were after the Cooper. Yeah.
Oh, it's funny. That's funny. Julian, Brant Vitek, who orthopedic surgeon now, solved all my mysteries for why I could never run the Cooper. And I'm in there seeing him for whatever ailment, as an adult. And he goes, BV, you're fast twitch muscle, not slow twitch. Exactly. I'm like, oh, you mean that? Yeah, you run sprints. You can't run any distance. I'm like, there you go.
Yeah.
I've stuck with that my whole life. I'm fast twitch muscles.
I actually think that's probably true. So,
yeah, I agree.
yeah. So it's a good excuse that happens to be true. Well, look, guys, this has been great. I'm actually glad we broke it up. Unfortunately, sorry again about your daughter's Scott that got in an accident, but I thought we got a chance to really get a lot of great UVA material in here and a lot of great stories about Coach Bruce, and you guys had a tremendous career at UVA and also up here in Northern Virginia as well. Look, thanks for doing this. Brian, we're almost neighbors. We'll have to meet for a beer sometime.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we can get Keith to come out to the country and see us, or we'll go down there and get him. And Scott, hopefully next time you're in town.
You're all invited out to San Diego anytime.
Yeah, Brian, the last time I saw Scott, Scott came to watch my son play in a playoff game, huge rivalry, Yorktown versus Washington Liberty. And I had been the Preakness that day, or I guess Black Eyed Susan the day before. So it was like it was 100 degrees that day. It was horrible. So we took this huge loss to Washington Liberty that day, and I was just devastated. I was tired, and Scott wanted to go get a drink. I couldn't even hardly move. So I definitely owe Scott at least a beer on that one. But guys, look, this has been great. I really enjoyed hearing your stories, and I learned a lot about soccer. I was not a fan of soccer back in the 80s. I was still in the basketball and football fog. But now I love the sport. So I really appreciate you guys sharing your stories with me, and maybe we can do another one of these things one of these days as well.
Love it.
Sure.
Love it.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks for having us.
And Scott.
Good to see you, Brian. Good to see you, Scott.
Yeah.
Julian, thank you.
In touch.
Together.
Oh, yeah. Of course.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah.
Yeah, guys. Well, let's keep in touch and do this again sometime.
Wahoo wah.